What's on? Watch me.
Okay, so this is my favorite video. As a researcher, understanding the why things happen is perhaps the most exciting. So we've talked about how television drives the greatest sales uplift. It does over time. In terms of synergy, it performs the best. We talked about individual ads, but why is it consistently better? Like what else is going on that sits behind this? And this is what this section talks about. It talks about other variables of interest which we know have a relationship with impact, essentially. So the four that we're going to cover today are attention, which we talked about a bit in terms of the way that we collect attention. So it's gaze, whether someone's looking or not looking, pretty simple. Coverage, which is an artifact of spatial clutter. So it's understanding how big an ad is on screen. And similarly, viewability, which is a combination of how big the ad is on screen and time, and sound, which is a pretty important factor since it turns out. So let's start with attention. Let's kind of start with why we even collect it, right? Because we've talked about cut through, we've talked about attention. Why is there a relationship between attention and sales uplift? And the reality is there is, and we see this consistently. So what you can see from some of the work that we've done with previous clients, including Dentsu from our recent collection, shows that that impact, or STAS, or sales uplift, however we want to call it, depends heavily on the degree of attention that's paid. So in this graph, we can see actually that while more attention is better, there is actually quite a significant uplift in sales, even if they're paying low attention, okay? So someone doesn't necessarily have to be significantly staring at the screen, sustained, consistent, undivided attention for an ad to have impact. And we know that this is a good thing, because what we can actually see in our data is that advertising, we know that advertising is not a high priority, but people switch in and out of focus, right? So the notion that attention to ads is sustained, high level of engagement, is a false notion. We are so busy, we have other things in our world. So what tends to happen is we'll start with non-attention, then we might pay a fleeting second of high attention, then we might switch back to medium attention, then high attention, then we might leave the room. So we see this in our data, that during a typical ad, we jump from low, medium, high, and non-attention. So it's important to, understand that even of the best of platforms, in an average second, you're never going to get 100% attention, because that's not a reality. But B, there are some other factors that do play a role in this gaining of attention. But let's start with what the platforms actually do in terms of their attention scores. Now, we talked about in the technology section, we talked about how we collect it. So it's a distribution. So we collect whether they're looking straight at the ad, whether they're not looking at their ad, but they're in eye shot and ear shot, or whether they're not there at all, whether we can't see a face whatsoever. So the way that we start with rating a platform is understanding in an average second how, on average, how does this rate? So with all of those combined, in an average second, what is their score? So what we can see is that in an average second, TV commands more attention, right? So bearing in mind that even a score of 60 means that only 60% of an average second of viewing had some attention paid. And this is what I mean by people don't pay undivided attention all the time. Otherwise, this average would be 100. So this score is a combination of different levels of attention paid in an average second. But TV by far commands more attention to the socials like Instagram and Facebook. But actually YouTube command a decent amount of attention as well. With that said, there are some nuances that sit behind number of seconds, and we'll talk about those in a minute. But what this slide shows is that in an average second, TV commands more attention than YouTube, and considerably more than Facebook and Instagram. What I wanted to talk to you about with the YouTube findings are that Skippable actually drives their average up. So again, an average is a distribution. So what we can see in the data quite clearly is that a skippable ad, where you ask someone to skip in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, they're typically staring at the screen waiting for it to go. So what actually happens is the average increases because skippable ad gives them 5 seconds of high attention. So when we remove those, the average is much lower and a little bit more aligned to other socials. So what I will say as well is that of all content viewed on YouTube, 43% was skipped. This is a really interesting point. So the other thing that's also interesting, so regardless of an average second, it's also about how many attentive seconds. So we can definitely see a relationship between not just the average of attention, but how many seconds attention is held and stats. And what we can see with TV, that TV achieves more attentive seconds than the other platforms by far. So this is where it starts to differ itself from the likes of YouTube. So while in an average second, YouTube actually gains similar attention to TV, when you actually talk about sustained, so over time, that's where it doesn't quite so fare. So in what we found in our data, and remember this is across 3 different countries, we see that TV on average gains 15 seconds of attention, or 15 attentive seconds, if you want to put it that way. And again, attentive seconds are any attention paid, so it removes the non-attention. Whereas with YouTube, the 5 seconds of attentive, which is exactly what represents the skippable proportion. Instagram 3 and Facebook 4 attentive seconds. So when you think about ad placement, the best you can achieve is 5 attentive seconds. Your ad has to be quite quick, quite different, deliver quite quickly. So the other thing that's important is screen coverage. And we look at screen coverage a bit like spatial clutter. So screen coverage, let me try and explain, is the proportion of the screen that the ad covers. So spatial clutter significantly reduces the ability for an ad to have an impact, right? So if there's more competitive clutter going on around the screen, then the ad is less of a focal point. And we know that coverage and STAS have a relationship as well. So again, we'll get to the results in a minute, but this is why we look at coverage as an important factor of success. That when screen coverage is low, more clutter appears, the less the impact is likely. And what we can see is that screen coverage actually varies quite considerably across platforms, which is, again, we're talking about the why TV rates so highly or does so well in terms of impact. This is another factor. So TV, pretty much, average screen coverage is 100% screen covered 100% of the time. Whereas when you look at the competitor platforms, and that includes BVOD, but when you include the competitor platforms, what you'll see is that coverage sits quite firmly around 30 to 32%. And that's consistent across time. We see that in a lot of other work that we've done. And that's because the functionality of those platforms is very different. So programming is designed to be all of screen. Ads are designed to be all of screen, whereas the platforms are looking for a mix of content and advertising. So, at the end of the day, the modality is different, which is why these results show. But again, spatial clutter appears, it's likely to have less impact, or the ad is likely to have less impact. So these numbers come from all of our data, but in fairness to the socials, this number is slightly higher if we only look at ads that hit the MRC 50% pixel standard. And why is this? Because coverage and pixels are highly related, and we talk about the MRC standard next. So this is a correlated variable. So viewability is a combination of pixels and time. I think what I might try and do is explain where viewability comes from. So several years ago, which I'm sure many of you know or are aware now, the MRC stepped in and in order to regulate a fairly unregulated industry, which was impressions on digital. And what they did is they said we need to inform a viewability standard so that an impression, you don't have to pay for an impression unless it's 50% pixels and 2 seconds of time, and that's together. So pixels and time is what we're looking at. We've already looked at attentive seconds, but pixels is an artifact also of a spatial clutter, but it's not about how much of the screen it covers, it's about how much of the ad is on screen. So the difference is the coverage is how much of the screen the ad covers. Pixels is how much of the ad is on screen. So when you scroll, you can quite often have 50%, 60%, 70%, 10%, 20% of an ad on screen. So that's an artifact of scrolling. Okay, and we know that pixels really matter a great deal to attention. So when ad pixels are low, and we've seen this in a lot of the work we've done before, if an ad can't be seen, it can't have an impact. I don't think you need a PhD for that one. It means that lower attention and lower likelihood of the brand to be chosen if the pixels are low. And again, this is consistent. We've seen this a lot of time. So what it means is that if the average pixels on screen varies across platforms, it's bound to have an impact, and it's bound to have a relationship between the initial stats, and we see that. So even in this data, we see that pixels vary significantly across platforms. So TV average pixels, again, are 100% pixels 100% of the time, and what that means is it's about 35 points greater every single time an ad loads than its competitors. But again, like coverage, to be fair to the socials, this number is slightly higher if we only look at ads that hit the MRC 50% pixel standard. So in this slide, we are removing ads that sit on screen below 50%. And, if you actually think about it logically, if an ad is only half shown and the brand is in the half that's not shown, how can that ad have an impact at the purchase occasion? So low ad pixels can be the difference between seeing the brand or not, and it makes a big difference. And at the end of the day, let's just take a step back. When the brand is missing, we fill in the blanks, and what that means is what will happen is the attention you work so hard for will likely be attributed to a bigger competitor. Again, back to the double jeopardy effect. So if an ad is played but the brand is not present, it's more likely that you will attribute that particular ad to the greater competitor, the one that has the greater market share. That's just the nature of double jeopardy. Okay, so plus time varies. So we talk about time before in terms of attentive seconds, so this one's going to make some sense. So plus time playing varies significantly across platform. So average time playing is anything that has 50% pixels or greater, and it's averaged across all of the ad lengths. So we take ad length into account here. And what we can see is that TV ads are around 4.5 times longer in view than Facebook and around 1.5 times longer than YouTube. Again, after 50% pixels. That doesn't even account for anything below 50% pixels in the socials. But I do know that they're MRC compliant. So in most cases, advertisers would only pay for an ad if it was 50% pixels or greater. So you can see, so TV renders 18 seconds in view, 18 seconds for BVOD, 12 for YouTube, 3 for Instagram, and 4 for Facebook. So again, if you've got an issue with pixels, if you've got an issue with time, if you've got an issue with coverage, then you're going to have an issue with attention. If you've got an issue with attention, it's going to impact your stats score. And lastly, a little finding that we just want to talk about. We talk a lot about visual attention, but the reality is we are auditory creatures, right? So we listen as well as we view. So sound on or off and at the volume was something that we collected in this research to understand whether sound actually might truly have an impact on stats and attention, and it does. So what we see is that attention and sound are related. And in brief, what we can see is there is actually a sweet spot, right? So bearing in mind, there are a lot of different platforms at play here, and we'll talk about those in a minute. But the average sweet spot is around 70% volume. That's where we see that at that point is when the impact of attention starts to kick in. So sadly, a lot of the platforms actually have very low volume and very few people that turn it on. So the next slide shows you that TV and YouTube have the greatest number of viewers who also have their sound up the highest. So this slide shows you the proportion of people that even have the sound on, right? So when you go down to Instagram, for example, generally people, only 20% of viewers will have the sound on at all, and their average volume is at 41% of their capacity. Facebook, they have a greater proportion of people who have the sound on, but the average volume is significantly lower, so it's kind of counteracting each other. Whereas with BVOD and TV, actually I will say not television proper, but BVOD on mobile. And I'll say that because we can't collect sound on linear TV. We do it through our mobile device, so we can only look at this study through any of the mobile collections we do. Whereas with BVOD and YouTube, they have a much greater proportion of people that have the sound on all the time. And that makes sense if you think about the content, you're interested in the programming, right? And the volume, the average volume is high as well. So I guess the point there is that, sound matters, pixels matter, coverage matters, and all of these time matters, and all of these things are related back to attention, and attention is related to advertising strength, and TV by far do better on all of those factors.
Watch me. Anything could happen, bigger than we imagine. We're gonna break free. Screenforce, what's on? Watch me.